and everyone's excited because it's it's the festival week. It's Passover. We're here. We're ready to have a good time. And so when you get crowds together and they're excited, excitement is contagious. And so Jesus is coming. He's popular. We're excited. We're already excited. And there's a no because everyone's excited. But the authors of the New Testament link it to Old Testament prophecy. So as Greg said, it's prophetic. And they're letting us know, yes, absolutely, Jesus is king, but he's a certain kind of king. And no one saw it yet. And so they're foreshadowing things to come. So that's a big part of it. They make it very clear that Jesus is king, but it's not as clear what kind of king he is, or if everyone understood what kind of king he is based on what he's writing and what's being said and what's being done in the full context. But also there are three other elements or three little details that Luke, John, and Mark individually point out on Sunday. In Luke's gospel, in Luke 19, he mentions that Jesus is looking over Jerusalem and he weeps, and his heart is broken. That's an interesting detail that puts it in fuller context of everything he's about to do. Again, is meaningful and it's heartfelt as he cares for his people. And then John's gospel in John 12, Jesus foretells his own death. He lets them know, my death is coming. And in John's gospel, in that passage, the audible voice of God responds as Jesus is talking and praying out loud for people to hear, asking for God to be glorified. God responds. And John says the people couldn't understand it because it just sounded like thunder. But it's just, again, really deeper level meaning. There's something going on here. And then in Mark, this is just a fun side little detail. Jesus shows up at the temple, and he looks around, but he doesn't do anything yet because it's too late in the day, and he's going to come back tomorrow. And so that lets us know, okay, more is coming. So that brings us to Holy Monday, and Jesus has a lot of serious, important work ahead of him this week. Early in the morning, on the way in, Jesus curses the fig tree. And do you remember that story? Remember the issue that Jesus had with the fig tree? From a distance, it looked good. It was pretty. It was full of leaf. But when he got up to it, it had no fruit, right? And so he curses it, and it withers. And it's this powerful statement and this powerful imagery of judgment and coming judgment. And then the big thing that we remember from that Monday, and I think this is on our map, if I can find it, yeah, right here. The cleansing of the temple. Who can give me a rundown of what happens there? So Jesus shows up in the temple, a place he'd been many times before, and what happens? He causes a scene, right? He's unruly. He's angry. He's yelling. He flips tables. He has a whip out of nowhere, and he's like whipping at people and screaming and calling them all sorts of names and just stressing me out just to read it all these years later. But what was his point, though? You've taken something that was holy and supposed to be good and supposed to be a blessing for people as they seek to draw near to God, and you've warped it and you've corrupted it and you've desecrated it. And this is not okay. Judgment. God notices, God cares when we do these things. And so Jesus literally tears it all apart, and figuratively as well. And as a result, who's mad? The people in charge. The people who stand to profit, the people who had been running things. This is disorderly. This does not make us look good, but also you stopped our profit margins, and so there's problems here. And so from that moment, each of the gospel writers, Mark, Luke, and John, mention that the religious leaders are angry at Jesus. And he's had run-ins with them before, but now they're really mad because he's on their turf, messing up their, it's a feast week. The Passover, everyone's here. We can make so much money here, and we've set this thing up to run well that we've got to get rid of this guy. And that's what the Gospels tell us. They start conspiring. They start planning and scheming, trying to figure out a way to get Jesus out of here, to destroy him. And at this point, what a start to a week. What a Monday. Things are ramping up. You got a comment?
I just, after the next Sunday, they won't need to sell any sacrifice. There will be nothing to sacrifice.
Well, yes, in one sense. But for those who don't believe, they kept it going for a while, though, didn't they? Yeah. Yeah, interesting. So the sacrificial system, Jesus has things to say about that. Absolutely. So he's building up. There's a lot of foreshadowing there. And Jesus has made it very clear at the front of this week where he stands, and then he's not going to back down. And this is going to get more and more intense moving forward. So that moves us into Tuesday. And on our map that's here, and this map just very generally says Jesus teaches with and disputes with the authorities. And so let me give you a rundown of what happens here. Jesus explains to his disciples, his followers, the whole thing with the fig tree, and he uses it not just to teach about judgment, but he moves it to a deeper point about having faith in God. And the disciples have no idea what he's talking about, which they spent most of their time kind of scratching their heads and being like, we don't know what to do with you. But then he moves into the temple again as he'd been coming in each day, and he faces what we can categorize as four main types of controversial confrontations with the religious leaders. The first one, they come to him and they question his authority in front of everyone. Tell us by what authority you say and do all these things. You made a mess here yesterday. Who are you to do these things? And Jesus turns it around on them with a question of his own, which they squirm and don't answer. And then he transitions directly into parables that don't cast them in the best light. Parable of the two sons, the wicked tenants, the marriage feast. And it makes them look really bad if they're listening and paying attention to what he's talking about. Then they also question his allegiance. Again, they're trying to trap him. They're trying to trick him. They're trying to do whatever they can to discredit him, to shame him, and otherwise get rid of him. But Jesus answers perfectly in a way that somehow balances paying taxes, but also being true and honoring the Lord. And this answer stuns them. And the gospel writers give you this detail that the people marveled at Jesus, and his questioners got real quiet. Because, I don't know if we want to keep asking him questions, but they do. Another group comes up to him, the Sadducees, who don't believe in a resurrection of the dead, Scripture tells us, but they ask him a question about the resurrection, again, trying to trick him, and Jesus calls them out for not knowing and understanding the Scriptures that they claim to know and understand, makes them look bad. And then they come and they ask him about the greatest commandment. Okay, if you're so smart, if you know Scripture so well, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus, again, answers so well that it stuns them, that the crowds are astonished, and they're like cheering him on. This guy's amazing, and makes the leaders look ignorant and shameful again. And it just gets to the point that they stop asking him questions. We're going to have to regroup, go back to the drawing board. This is not working. The crowd is loving him more and more and more, and we're looking worse and worse and worse. So we're going to stop. But Jesus isn't done. So they think they're done. Okay, we withdraw. We're not fighting anymore in this moment. But Jesus has more to say, and he goes into this section where he teaches authoritatively. The Gospels say, and he teaches about two main things in this section: judgment. This is where he gets very, very pointed about the religious leaders. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees! And he has really terrible things to say about them, and he does not mince his words. Very, very directly, he calls them out for their wickedness and their corruption, and he lays it on really thick. And then he transitions to talking about things to come in the near future and then in the far future. So he's saying really hard things and also really confusing things, and it's just really overwhelming. But the gospel writers, again, give us clues to understand what's going on. What he's increasingly doing is not just speaking truth, absolutely, but how and why and what way and for what reason. They let you know the crowds are increasingly impressed and amazed and drawn to Jesus, and those who oppose him are getting angrier and angrier and angrier. So we're turning the heat up, and the tension is rising, and there's no backing down. So that's Tuesday. Then we get to Wednesday, and where are we on our map here? I've lost it. Did y'all see Wednesday? Okay. Oh, yes, that's in my notes. Let me tell you why you don't see anything on Wednesday. So Wednesday, Jesus does nothing, or nothing that is directly recorded. On this day, he was likely still doing what he had been doing. It was his pattern to go in the morning to the temple to teach, to interact, to meet with the people, and then go spend the night in Bethany. So it's likely that he did this, but the gospel writers don't focus on that anymore. They shift their attention to a few other things. One, Caiaphas, the chief priest, had been scheming privately with others how to get rid of Jesus. And again, none of their plans had been working. They're increasingly frustrated and embarrassed, and they don't know what to do. The crowds, they're aware, love Jesus and are getting more and more and more amped up to follow him. And so they're in a tight space. They can't figure out what they're going to do. And then Judas comes knocking on their door. And he says, I got a plan. And before I get back to that, there's this interesting little story that the gospel writers put in. A woman comes and anoints Jesus with oil. Do you remember the story? And it's this beautiful moment of worship where she recognizes there's something special about Jesus, and he's worthy of any worship I could possibly give him. But what happens in that moment? Is everyone impressed? They're mad, the disciples. And so it's not even the bad guys that were conditioned at this point to understand, well, those guys were jerks anyway. It's the guys who should know better. I mean, this isn't new to the scene in the life and ministry of Jesus. This kind of situation has happened before with a different woman in a different place, had come and broken expensive perfume over his feet and wept and cleaned it up with her hair. I mean, beautiful moment of vulnerability, but worship. And this woman saw Jesus for who he was when no one else did, right? But the disciples are angry. And do you remember why in particular this week? What a waste of money. What a waste. It doesn't matter how beautiful this moment of worship is. It doesn't matter that Jesus himself was moved by it. You know what we could have done with that money? We could have sold this, and we could have done good things for the poor, which is usually a really bad excuse for we don't like what's going on here, right? But what's interesting, again, the flow of the narrative here, right on the heels of this, the gospel writers tell you Judas, who was really mad because he was the money keeper, he was the accountant of the disciples, did not like what was going on in that scene. He goes to the chief priest and says, I got a plan. And if you pay me, I will find a way to get Jesus into your hands, right? So it's this really interesting moment. We don't know his clear and most direct motives. We know he was greedy. In Luke's gospel, he gives you this really intriguing detail about how Satan entered into Judas. And I don't think of like Hollywood exorcisms where he's like possessed and like floating around. I think his heart had been repeatedly, ongoingly, progressively hardened to who Jesus was and what Jesus was about. Judas was not called to be a disciple on accident. Jesus knew what was going on. Jesus also knew what was coming. But Judas, for several years, had opportunities to see Jesus for who he was, to hear the message and the heartbeat of what we now know is the gospel of Jesus. And repeatedly, progressively, he turned from it, and it got to a point of no return where he was fully open to anti-Jesus. And so he was open to the schemes of the devil. And so the devil didn't just have to sneak his way in. Judas had opened his heart to it, and the devil took full advantage and then worked through him to do what ended up happening. And so Judas was greedy, but I think the deeper issue here that the gospel writers are pointing you to is Judas couldn't see Jesus for who he was. And what he saw, or maybe he did see Jesus for who he was and didn't like it, because that's not the kind of Messiah that I want. I want him to be different, and he's not. And so let's get rid of him. So he falls for that trap. And the religious leaders, it says, were excited. They were glad to receive him. They would have paid him anything. And so 30 pieces of silver is nothing to get Jesus off our back. So that's Wednesday. Then we move into Thursday, and Thursday does show back up on our map. And we got some right here, but I think it starts here. And this is where things are really going to start ramping up. So this is numbered 1, and then 2 here, 3 here, and then it moves to 4 into Friday, and things are really starting to move downhill. This is often called today Maundy, not Monday, Maundy Thursday, which is based on the Latin word for commandment, because on this day, Jesus gives his disciples a new commandment, the commandment to love. That's John 13. If you come Sunday, the preacher might be preaching out of John 13, just as a teaser for you. But on this day is when the really classic moments of Holy Week happen. And so there's the upper room where Jesus gathers with his closest friends and his followers to partake in the Passover, which is why they were there to begin with, they thought. And it's this really intimate, special, meaningful event. Again, John 13, Jesus takes a moment and he washes the feet of his disciples, which confuses them, and they still don't quite get what he's doing. And as he's explaining it, Peter, who's constantly running his mouth, still misses it and doesn't get the point, and Jesus is trying to explain what's coming. Again, he'd been talking about his death and his crucifixion, but he's making it increasingly more direct and explicit that it's coming. Then all the Gospels mention too that Jesus moves into, Matthew, Mark, and Luke mention Jesus institutes what we now call the Lord's Supper. And so he takes a moment, which they were already gathered, which was highly significant and important, and he uses that as the foundation to institute what we now call the Lord's Supper. And he says, this thing that was so meaningful is meaningful, and because of me, because of God the Father's work through me, it's going to be even more meaningful than you could possibly imagine. You think of the Old Covenant and God's work in the life of his people and the Passover event and how God has provided. God has provided again. There's a new covenant coming, and the disciples in the moment don't fully get it, even though he's explaining the deeper meaning behind his sacrifice. And then from there, after that evening, and it was a full evening, they go out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus, again, is getting, we're getting real close to when action just is nonstop, and Jesus is telling them what's coming, and he tells them, look, here in just a moment, you're going to abandon me. Things are going to get really scary, and you're going to leave me. I'm going to die, but I won't stay dead. He's telling them this, and they're not hearing it, and Peter, like Peter does, like so many of us does, said, never. I would never leave you. Are you kidding me? And Jesus says, Peter, not only are you going to abandon me when I need you most, you're going to deny the fact that you even know me 3 times, right? And Peter says, oh, no, Lord. And I love the New Testament. It tells us, he says, no, I would never. Matter of fact, not only would I never deny you, I would die for you. And the other disciples at this point are like, yeah, us too. That's what yes, he's speaking for us. We would never abandon you or deny you. We would die for you if it came for it. And Jesus knows that that's not true. But they sit in that moment. Jesus goes in a little further into Gethsemane. He prays. We know what that's about, so I'm not going to go into that. This is a really powerful moment of Jesus, very open and raw and vulnerable before God the Father, really wrestling with the weight of what's coming, the gravity of what's coming. It is crushing him, but he says, no matter what, though, your will be done, and God's will is going to be done. And that bleeds then into Good Friday. So this is late Thursday night, early Friday morning. Judas shows back up, and he's not alone. He has his armed guards and some of the religious leaders and their henchmen, if you will. And Jesus is arrested in the garden. Again, and there's so much going on, surface level, and the New Testament authors, that gospel writers are giving you deeper level meaning to. So this Peter, who had just said, I would never leave you, I'll never abandon you, I would even die for you. When the gang comes, the mob, with their clubs and their torches and their shackles to arrest Jesus, what does Peter do? He springs into action, and he pulls out his sword, and he just starts hacking away, right? But what does Jesus do? You still don't get it. You still don't get it. I've been telling you and telling you and telling you, it's coming, it's now here, and you still don't get it. This is not the way. And he heals the guy, and then he lets them carry him off. And he said, where have you been? I've been out in public all day, every day this week, and you had nothing to say. But now in the dead of night, which John plays with a lot of that imagery, the light and the dark, right? This seems shady. This seems underhanded. This seems evil and wicked. And Jesus tells him that, but he goes. He goes with them. And then what happens to all those big, bold, brave disciples? Like roaches when you turn the light on, right? They just scatter. They vanish. They're gone. And there's one disciple that's not named, but we think we know who he is, who's kind of like following them in the darkness, and they figure out he's following them. And so they're like, we're going to arrest you too. And he runs away naked because they're like grabbing his clothes. What a big, brave man that he was, all of them. So bold. I would die for you, Jesus. running away naked in the dark is not probably how he thought that was going to play out. But again, I mean, things have been building, and they're still building, and there's still even more to come. The Jewish leaders put Jesus through this sham trial. And as I was studying today, we don't have time to go into depth and detail about it. It's really fascinating, though, how they did it is contrary to how they were supposed to run things. Again, it's in the dead of night. That's peculiar. That seems underhanded. It seems like we're trying to hide things. They went against their own rules and conventions for how they were supposed to operate, how they were supposed to structure this kind of thing. And then the trial itself, it kind of plays out in two parts. And it's just filled with lies and deceit because they've been trying to build this case against Jesus, who we know was innocent and righteous. And so they're trying to fill it with false testimonies, and they eventually try to catch him on the fact that he claimed to be king, like he claimed to be one with God. All right, we can work with that. And so they arrest him. They decide that he's already arrested. They declare him guilty. The verdict: you're condemned. This is, you can't do these things, but they don't have the power to like kill him themselves. But they're as human beings, political creatures, and so they're like, let's use politics. We've been using politics. It hadn't been working. Now it's finally working. We've trapped him. And so they take Jesus over to Pilate, who's the Roman governor who's in charge there, who does have the power to kill. But in the middle of this, as all this is happening, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting our map. We're now in the middle of the city, and we're about to be bouncing back and forth all over the place here. In the middle of this, Peter, who had been so big and so bold, and who had stepped up initially, was ready to throw down and did, and was swinging his sword and hacking at people, who then had scattered in fear and confusion and didn't know what to do, didn't just go home and didn't run away. He just kind of lurked. Like he conflicted. He's such a man, just like, he's so impulsive, and he can be so like, his mouth is so much faster than his head and his heart. And there's so many of us today that are like that, and so we can relate to that. But he's conflicted, like he's not there helping Jesus, but he can't quite go home. So he's in the courtyard, and people notice him. Aren't you? Wait. Yeah, we know you. You're one of his followers. He says, no, I don't know what you're talking about. Someone else. No, yeah, I recognize your accent. You're from Galilee. Yeah, you follow this Jesus. He's like, you must have me confused with someone else. And then a third person says, no, we're sure. I've seen you with him. You're his follower. And he says, no, I promise. And then the text gives you this detail. He emphatically denies, emphatically rejects the fact that he even knows Jesus. And there's this terrifying, heartbreaking note that Luke throws in, that at that moment, each of the gospel writers say that rooster crowed, just as Jesus said it would. I mean, right at that time, which is powerful enough. But Luke adds this line that at that third rejection of even knowing Jesus, Peter looks up and Jesus looks out, and they make eye contact as Jesus is being beaten and mocked and on the sham trial. He's hearing in the courtyard and then watching one of his best friends, his closest confidants and followers, deny that he even knows him. And then it says Peter breaks down and just weeps bitterly in the night. Okay, so that's what's going on the side. Back to the trial. They send Jesus over to Pilate, who does not know what to do with him. There's like none of these charges can really hold any water. There's nothing here. I mean, I can't work with this. He's innocent. But on top of that, Pilate, like personally, the scripture says, is amazed. I've never met someone like this Jesus, and how Jesus handles this, how Jesus responds and doesn't respond, how he carries himself. The whole scene, it says, amazes Pilate. He is intrigued at Jesus. But since the crowd won't relent, and now they're like a mob, the religious leaders are angry, and they're all yelling different things, and it's getting to be a bigger and bigger headache. Someone eventually says, Jesus has been causing problems everywhere. He's riling the people up. He's a revolutionary from here to Galilee. And Pilate says, did you say Galilee? They're like, yeah, he's a Galilean. He's like, cool, send him to Herod because that's his jurisdiction. So like, okay. So they go across the street, you see in the map, to Herod, who was kind of like he was a puppet at this point, didn't really have real power. And he's another story for another day. Herod, scripture tells us, was really excited to see Jesus. I've heard so much about you. I've heard you can do miracles and signs, and so why not now? What a wonderful opportunity. Herod does not care what's going on here. Again, this whole thing's a sham. It doesn't matter that Jesus is innocent. It does not matter that they had treated him shamefully. They had been beating him up and mocking him and all these horrible things. Herod's like, oh, a circus monkey, do a trick. And Jesus won't do it. Jesus won't play into his game. And so Herod gets bored and sends him back to Pilate. There's nothing I can do about it. Go back to Pilate. Pilate's like, there's nothing I can do with this guy. And he keeps trying to release him, but the people won't. They're clamoring. They're out for blood, as we say. So he says, fine. Do you want me to, do you want him or do you want someone else? Barabbas, who was like a revolutionary. Do you want this insurrectionist, this criminal, this guy who's murdered people? Or do you want Jesus, who we all know is innocent? And they're like, oh, we want Barabbas. We want the murderer. We want the angry guy, the violent one. And Pilate's just like, okay, whatever. It's your business now, and wants to wash his hands of it. And then he's like, okay, but we're Romans, and we like to torture people. So they torture Jesus, and they beat him, and they flog him, and they do all the horrible things that they're so good at doing. But even then, Pilate's like, I'm not going to kill this guy because he doesn't deserve it. But the people cry out, no, we want you to kill him. Pilate's like, you what? Like, no, we want all of them. And they're like chanting, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate's like, whatever. Y'all are about to be a riot, so I don't think he's innocent. I don't think he's guilty. He doesn't deserve this, but I don't care enough about him. I care more about my skin, and if you're going to cause too many problems, then you can just have him. So he releases Jesus over to them. They beat him up more. They torture him more. They mock him more. And during this time, Matthew's gospel brings Judas back in, who's been in the wings, kind of quietly. We haven't heard from him. And Matthew points out Judas was there, and he's watching all this unfold, and it finally sinks in what he's done. And he's heartbroken, and he's devastated. He's like, now I get it, and I was wrong. And he's devastated by his decision, and he goes back to the people, the religious leaders who had paid him to begin with. He says, take your money back. I don't want anything to do with this. I was wrong. We all know he was innocent. And he's pleading his case, and they say, no, this is your business, man. You've done this. You've already set this in motion. There's no stopping it. Good luck. And it says he throws the money down. He doesn't want this blood money, and he runs out, and he takes his own life. Doesn't know how to move forward from there. Again, Jesus is tortured, mocked, ultimately crucified. So when they do all this, again, no one has slept, it seems, since Thursday night. This is well into Friday now. They had been moving back and forth all throughout here. But once they've decided after the final, torture of Jesus, they're going to lead him through town, outside of town where everyone can see him. Golgotha, the hill there, where everyone can see him. And we've talked about that before, taking the trash to the curb, as the Romans would say. And they strung him up, and they crucify him, and he dies. Then after he dies, this is all still on Friday, they take him down. Joseph of Arimathea, who we find out, Scripture gives us, again, these little details that are important. He was very wealthy. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. That's the ruling council of the Jews, which is interesting. He did not agree with the verdict that led them to this moment of crucifying Jesus. And secretly, similar to Nicodemus, he'd been a follower of Jesus and had been progressively more and more drawn to Jesus and seeing him for who he was. So because of his status and his wealth, it took boldness to put his neck on the line like this, but he had the opportunity to go before Pilate and say, can I have the body? We need to do right by the body. We want to bury it. And Pilate says, okay, you can have him. And so he takes him. He retrieves the body. He prepares the body. And then he puts Jesus in this new tomb that no one had been in before. And that gets us to Saturday. And we often call that, in modern day, Silent Saturday, because nothing's happening. All this energy, all this activity had been building and building and building to Thursday night, Friday morning, and it explodes ultimately on Golgotha, and it comes to this shocking silence. Jesus is in the grave. The disciples are scattered. One of them's already dead. No one knows what's going on. Everything's upside down and inside out. Heartbreak, panic, fear. If they would do this to Jesus, are they going to come to us? Just horrible, horrible scene, and it's dead quiet. It seems like they've lost. It seems like God's team has lost, and Jesus, all the negative things they'd been saying about it, it seems that they were right. But again, the gospel writers say there's more going on here before we get to the good stuff. It said, even still, even when it seems like Jesus' opponents had finally somehow won and silenced him for good, they're nervous. This is Matthew 27, 62 through 66. And the chief priests say, listen, we're never quite fully done with people like this, so go station some guards at the tomb. Because heaven forbid some of his followers steal the body and then claim that he's risen from the dead, and then we have to deal with this all over again, he's a symbol of the people and all this stuff. So they station guards because they're nervous. And then we come to Sunday, and what happens Sunday? He's not there. And why is he not there? Because he's risen. And who gets to see that first? Who gets to learn first? The women. The first Easter preachers are the women who come to the tomb to grieve, and they find out that he's not there. And the angel says, why are you looking for him here? He's risen just as he said he would. Go tell the disciples. And so they run off and tell him. But then in John's gospel, Mary is there, Mary Magdalene, and she comes to Jesus, and she's, heartbroken. And she's now extra heartbroken because his body's not even there. And the gardener comes up, and John says, it's not the gardener, it's Jesus. And she's just devastated in her grief. She can't see him for who he is, which again is such powerful imagery. And she's like, what? I don't. And the gardener says, who are you looking for? Well, Jesus, my Lord, we. And she, can't get the words out. And he says her name, just her name, Mary. And her eyes are finally open, and she turns to him, and she falls at his feet, weeping, and just beautiful, again, powerful moment of worship. And Jesus says, get up, don't cling to me here. We've got work to do. And he sends her out to go tell the disciples. And then the rest, as we say, is history. And all the brokenness and all the messed up twists and turns that the disciples and human beings and everyone else had caused all throughout, not just that week, not just his life and ministry, but since Genesis 3, as we studied last week. Jesus is here, and he said, I am the answer, and nothing's ever going to be the same again. Now go tell everyone. And that's what we're going to do come Sunday. All right, that was a lot. That was really fast. Any thoughts or questions on any of this? Well, good. Well, come Sunday, and we're going to celebrate that this story didn't end on that Friday or that Saturday, but it's still going today. All right, let's look at our prayer lists. See if I can find mine. What additions or corrections or updates do y'all have to our list tonight? You have one on Chet Jordan, okay? Okay. Oh, no. Okay. Okay. Okay, well, yeah, we'll definitely be praying for that. Thank you for that update. Any others? Yes, ma'am? Yeah, I don't see him. Okay, preemptive. Okay. Oh, good. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. That's that bottom name there. Is it Addie or 80? Addie Redfern, who's 8, is having some health issues with. Anyway, they're running tests and trying to medicate and get her stable. So pray for that. Any other? Yes, sir. his wife, Tiffany Sedate, is at the doctor and is having a spot of skin cancer. Okay, she's having it checked and treated. Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely pray for that. Okay, thank you for mentioning that. Any others that we can put down?